For decades, they were the untouchable pillars of British culture, knights of the realm and household names who defined entertainment from the swinging 60s to the glossy 90s. We invited them into our living rooms, trusting their warm smiles and eccentric charm. But as their twilight years approached, the mask slipped, revealing a horrifying reality of unchecked ego and disturbing predatory appetites. These are the men who believed their fame placed them above the law. Before we reveal the list, please subscribe and comment. Does absolute power always corrupt? Jimmy Savile. For decades, he was the eccentric uncle of the nation, a man instantly recognizable by his platinum bob, shell suits, and the ever-present cigar clamped between his teeth. Jimmy Savile was not just a disc jockey or a television presenter. He was a phenomenon, a man who raised £40 million for charity and was knighted by the Queen in 1990. He hosted Jim'll Fix It, a show that made dreams come true for millions of children, cementing his status as a benevolent wizard of the airwaves. Yet, beneath the veneer of eccentricity and philanthropy, lay one of the most chilling predators in British history. Savile did not just hide his dark nature, he hid in plain sight, using his charity work as a shield to access the very people he sought to harm. He groomed an entire nation into trusting him, creating a persona so powerful that to question him was to question the establishment itself. His eccentricity was a carefully calculated armor. By playing the fool, the oddball who lived in a camper van or a sparse penthouse in Leeds, he deflected scrutiny. Who would suspect the man running marathons for unparalleled causes of harboring such a monstrous secret? In reality, Savile used his access to hospitals, orphanages, and schools, granted to him because of his fundraising, as a hunting ground. He was given keys to wards, allowed to roam the corridors of Broadmoor Hospital and Stoke Mandeville unchecked, often in the dead of night. Staff members who raised concerns were dismissed or silenced, told that Sir Jimmy was a national hero doing good work. He weaponized his status, creating a culture of fear and deference where his victims felt powerless to speak out against a man who had the ear of prime ministers and royals. As he aged into his 70s and 80s, his behavior became even more brazen, bordering on a belief in his own immortality and invincibility. He would often drop hints in interviews, cryptic remarks about his preferences or his past that were laughed off as Jimmy being Jimmy. He surrounded himself with a protective circle, allegedly cultivating relationships with high-ranking police officers in what became known as the Friday Morning Club. He would host tea and coffee for officers at his home, solidifying a bond that made him effectively untouchable. Rumors swirled for years in the industry, whispers in newsrooms and dressing rooms about what happened in his caravan or backstage, but the fear of libel laws and his immense power kept the stories from print. He was a master manipulator who knew exactly how to charm those in power and intimidate those without it. The psychological game he played was terrifyingly effective. He would often flaunt his access, appearing in photographs with the highest echelons of society, implicitly signaling that he was protected. Even in his final years, when he was a frail old man, the predatory glint never left his eyes. He died in 2011, celebrated with a funeral fit for a state dignitary. His coffin paraded through the streets of Leeds while thousands mourned. It was only after his death, when the fear of retribution finally lifted, that the dam broke. One by one, then in their hundreds, survivors came forward to tell a story of a man who had used his fame to facilitate decades of abuse. The revelation shattered the country's trust in its institutions. The national treasure was revealed to be a national monster. His gravestone, an elaborate marble structure bearing the inscription, "It was good while it lasted," was dismantled and ground into dust at the request of his family, a symbolic attempt to erase his stain on the landscape. Savile's story is not just about one man's depravity, it is a damning indictment of a culture of deference that allowed a predator to operate with impunity for half a century. He died a free man, having lived a life of luxury and acclaim, leaving his victims to carry the burden of his crimes alone. It remains the biggest scandal in the history of the British entertainment industry, a stark reminder that sometimes the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. Rolf Harris. For over 5 decades, few faces were as comforting or as universally adored in British living rooms as that of Rolf Harris. With his trembling wobbleboard, his fascinating large-scale paintings, and his gentle, breathy voice, he was the quintessential eccentric uncle of the nation. From the 1960s onwards, he was a staple of family entertainment, eventually becoming the trusted face of Animal Hospital in the 1990s, a show where he displayed compassion for injured pets that melted the hearts of millions. He was so embedded in the cultural fabric of the United Kingdom that he was chosen to paint the official 80th birthday portrait of Her Majesty the Queen, a rare honor that signified his status as a true national treasure. He was the bearded, bespectacled artist who could do no wrong, a man whose catchphrase, "Can you tell what it is yet?" was mimicked in playgrounds across the country. However, behind the canvas and the kindly grandfather persona lurked a predator of staggering arrogance. Harris was not merely an entertainer. He was a man who believed his talent and his fame gave him a divine right to take whatever he wanted. For years, rumors had circulated in the industry about his wandering hands, but they were often dismissed as the tactile nature of an artistic temperament. It was not until the Operation U-Tree investigation, launched in the wake of the Jimmy Savile scandal, that the full, horrifying picture emerged. At the age of 83, when most men are settling into a quiet retirement, Harris was arrested, accused of a campaign of indecent assault that spanned 40 years. The shock was seismic. The man who had hugged children on television was revealed to be a serial abuser who had used his fame to entrap the vulnerable. During his trial in 2014, the mask of the nice old man slipped completely, revealing a figure of breathtaking narcissism. Harris did not display a shred of remorse or understanding of the gravity of the accusations. He arrived at court waving to the cameras, treating the proceedings like a minor inconvenience or a fan meet and greet. Inside the courtroom, he was combative and arrogant, dismissing the brave women who testified against him as liars and gold diggers. He seemed genuinely baffled that the laws of the land applied to him, a man who had performed at Glastonbury and rubbed shoulders with royalty. His defense was rooted in the belief that he was simply from a different era, a touchy-feely generation where boundaries were different, a pathetic excuse that the jury rightly saw through. The depth of his delusion was perhaps most evident in his behavior after the verdict. Even as he was stripped of his CBE, his BAFTA fellowship, and his Order of Australia, Harris maintained his innocence with a stubbornness that bordered on madness. While in prison, reports emerged that he had penned a song mocking his victims, referring to them as woodworm, that had come out of the woodwork to destroy him. It was the act of a man whose ego had completely detached from reality. He could not comprehend that he was the villain of the piece. In his own mind, he remained the beloved entertainer, unfairly persecuted by a world that had turned against him. He spent his final years in disgrace, a pariah whose murals were painted over and whose songs were scrubbed from the airwaves. The fall of Rolf Harris was a tragedy not for him, but for the culture that enabled him. He had groomed an entire nation into trusting him. He used the intimacy of his television shows, often filming in close quarters with young fans, as a cover for his predatory instincts. He relied on the fact that he was Rolf, the harmless artist, to silence anyone who felt uncomfortable. His story is a chilling reminder that predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes, they look like the kindly old man drawing cartoons on the television. He died in 2023, never having admitted his guilt, leaving a legacy that is now permanently stained by the pain he inflicted on those he should have protected. The boy from Bassendean ended his days not as a hero, but as a convicted criminal who spent his twilight years in a prison cell, raging against the dying of his own light. Stuart Hall. For an entire generation of British television viewers, the infectious, wheezing laughter of Stuart Hall was the soundtrack to family entertainment. As the presenter of the chaotic and beloved game show It's a Knockout from the 1970s to the 1980s, he was a figure of pure, unadulterated joy. With his theatrical vocabulary and his jovial demeanor, Hall was the eccentric uncle who brought a sense of fun and absurdity to the BBC. He was a broadcasting legend, a man who commentated on football with a poetic flair that was unique in the world of sport. His contribution to British culture was so significant that he was appointed an Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 2012 for his services to broadcasting and charity. He was 82 years old, a revered elder statesman of the industry who seemed destined to live out his final years basking in the warm glow of public adoration. However, the laughter that defined his career was merely a mask for a predator of terrifying arrogance. Beneath the jovial exterior was a man who viewed women, and disturbingly young girls, as commodities to be used for his own gratification. Hall did not just abuse his position, he reveled in it. During the peak of his fame in the 1970s and 80s, he treated the production sets of the BBC and the hospitals he visited for charity as his personal hunting grounds. He was described by those who later testified against him as an opportunist who would strike in the dressing rooms, the corridors, and even in the cars of his victims. He relied on the power imbalance between a famous television star and a starstruck fan to ensure their silence. He operated with a sense of entitlement that was breathtaking, believing that his celebrity status granted him immunity from the moral and legal codes that governed the rest of society. The true extent of his delusion and narcissism was revealed only when the law finally caught up with him in 2013. When he was first arrested as part of the wider investigation into historic abuse, Hall did not show humility or concern. Instead, he displayed a grotesque arrogance that shocked the public. He held an impromptu press conference outside his large Cheshire home, where he branded the allegations against him as pernicious, callous, and cruel. In a display of staggering insensitivity, he compared his situation to the persecution of the Jews during the Second World War, a comment that revealed a mind completely detached from the reality of his crimes. He mocked his accusers, dismissing the serious charges of indecent assault as nothing more than hysteria, painting himself as the victim of a witch hunt rather than a man facing justice for decades of abuse. Throughout the legal process, Hall maintained this facade of the persecuted genius. He attempted to charm the press, quoting Shakespeare and presenting himself as a martyr. It was the behavior of a man who had gone mad with his own self-importance, unable to comprehend that the world no longer viewed him as the funny man from the television, but as a criminal. It was only at the very 11th hour, when faced with the overwhelming evidence of 14 counts of indecent assault against 13 victims, that he finally entered a guilty plea. The national treasure was instantly erased. The BBC, which had once celebrated him, scrambled to remove his voice and image from their archives. He was stripped of his OBE and his knighthood of the microphone, his legacy turning to ash overnight. Stuart Hall was sentenced to 30 months in prison, a sentence that many felt was too lenient given the span of his offenses. He died in utter disgrace, a pariah whose name is now synonymous with the dark underbelly of light entertainment. His fall was not just about the crimes he committed, but about the sheer scale of the betrayal. He had been the voice of innocent fun, yet he was harboring a dark secret that shattered the lives of the women he targeted. He was a man who believed his own myth so completely that he thought he could rewrite the past. But in the end, the laughter stopped, and all that remained was the silence of his victims finally being heard. Gary Glitter. For a fleeting moment in the 1970s, and again during a nostalgic revival in the 1990s, the man born Paul Gadd was the undisputed leader of the gang. As Gary Glitter, he was the high camp king of glam rock, a figure of almost cartoonish extravagance who stomped across the top of the Pops stage in 6-inch platform boots and shimmering silver suits. His anthems, particularly Rock and Roll Part 2 and his ubiquitous Christmas hit, were the soundtrack to sporting events and festive parties across the United Kingdom. He was a national institution, a survivor of the music industry who had reinvented himself from a failed 60s singer into a beloved, eccentric icon. He was regarded with a sort of ironic affection by the British public, a man who refused to grow old gracefully and instead grew old loudly. However, beneath the glitter and the face paint, there lay a darkness that was as profound as it was disturbing. The leader was not merely a flamboyant showman, he was a man harboring a deep-seated and predatory obsession that would eventually destroy his life and reputation. The unraveling of his carefully constructed persona began in 1997, not through a police sting but through a moment of staggering arrogance and stupidity that bordered on madness. Glitter had taken his personal computer to a repair shop in Bristol, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the hard drive contained thousands of illicit images of underage children. When a technician stumbled upon the horrific cache, the police were notified, and the national treasure was arrested. The man who had once sung to millions was revealed to be a collector of the most depraved material imaginable, This discovery marked the beginning of a bizarre and desperate flight from justice that saw Glitter descend into a spiral of debauchery and exile. Rather than face the music in Britain after serving a short sentence for possession, he fled the country, embarking on a globe-trotting journey that read like a dark satire. He moved from Cuba to Cambodia and finally to Vietnam, seeking out countries where he believed his fame and wealth would buy him immunity and access to vulnerable young girls. It was here, in the humidity of Southeast Asia, that the madness of his entitlement truly took hold. He lived openly in Vung Tau, a coastal city where he was eventually arrested for obscene acts with minors. The image of the former pop star, now bloated and disheveled, being led away by Vietnamese police was a stark contrast to the glittering figure who had once commanded stadiums. His return to the United Kingdom in 2008 was met with universal revulsion. He was a pariah, a man whose name had become a byword for the worst kind of betrayal. Yet, even as he faced the legal system again in 2015 for historic offenses dating back to the 70s, Glitter displayed a chilling lack of remorse. He sat in the dock, an elderly man in his 70s, listening to the testimonies of women who had been children when he abused them, and he appeared entirely unmoved. He had spent decades believing that his status as a rock god gave him the right to take what he wanted, a delusion that persisted even as the prison doors slammed shut behind him. He was sentenced to 16 years, ensuring that he would likely die a prisoner. The fall of Gary Glitter was absolute. He was erased from the cultural history of Britain. His songs were banned from the airwaves, his likeness was removed from museums, and his records were pulled from shelves. He went from being the man who lit up Christmas to a figure of national shame. His story is a terrifying example of how fame can facilitate depravity, allowing a predator to hide in plain sight behind a wall of noise and sequins. The leader of the gang ended his days not in a mansion, but in a cell, stripped of his platforms and his power, leaving behind a legacy of pain that no amount of glitter could ever cover up. Jonathan King. In the Technicolor landscape of the British music industry from the 1960s to the 1990s, few figures were as ubiquitous or as flamboyantly eccentric as Jonathan King. He was a one-man hit factory, a Cambridge-educated pop mogul who burst onto the scene with the smash hit Everyone's Gone to the Moon. King was not merely a singer, he was a tastemaker, the man who famously discovered and named the band Genesis, giving the world Peter Gabriel and Phil Collins. With his signature flat cap, oversized spectacles, and a toothy grin that seemed permanently etched onto his face, he was a fixture on Top of the Pops and a regular columnist for major newspapers. He cultivated the persona of a perpetual teenager, a Peter Pan of pop who refused to grow up, selling himself to the public as a witty, harmless eccentric who understood the pulse of the youth better than anyone else. However, beneath the carefully curated image of the fun-loving impresario lay a predator of staggering arrogance. King's Peter Pan complex was not an innocent quirk. It was a disturbing cover for a deep-seated obsession with adolescent boys. For decades, he used his immense power and influence as a gatekeeper of the music industry to lure aspiring young musicians into his orbit. His lavish home in Walton-on-Thames became known within whispering circles not as a creative hub, but as a trap. King would invite young boys, often as young as 14 or 15, to his estate with promises of stardom, recording contracts, and the keys to the celebrity kingdom. He dazzled them with his wealth, his gold discs, and his connections, creating a power dynamic so lopsided that his victims felt utterly unable to refuse his advances. To King, these young men were not artists to be nurtured. They were perks of the job, commodities he felt entitled to sample because of his status. The madness of Jonathan King lay in his absolute, unwavering belief that he was above the moral laws of society. When the police finally came knocking in 2000, following the brave testimonies of men who had been abused by him decades earlier, King did not hide in shame. Instead, he treated the investigation with a grotesque sense of theatricality. He compared himself to Oscar Wilde, painting himself as a martyr for love and a victim of a puritanical society rather than a man accused of serious assaults on minors. He stood on the steps of the courthouse, smiling for the cameras, cracking jokes, and seemingly delighting in the attention. It was the behavior of a man whose ego had completely detached from reality. He could not comprehend that the world saw him as a monster. In his own mind, he was still the beloved pop genius, unfairly persecuted for his unconventional lifestyle. During his trial in 2001, the full extent of his predatory nature was laid bare. The court heard how he had groomed boys in the 1970s and 80s, using his fame to silence them. Yet, even as the guilty verdicts were read out for 6 counts of indecent assault and serious offenses against boys, King remained defiant. He showed zero remorse. He did not hang his head. He looked the jury in the eye with a look of disdain. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, a fall from grace that was absolute. The man who had once shaped the charts was now a convicted sex offender, his name scrubbed from the history books of the bands he had helped launch. Even after his release, King continued to protest his innocence with a fervor that bordered on delusion. He wrote blogs and gave interviews where he attempted to rewrite history, claiming that his victims were lying or that the encounters were consensual, a terrifying distortion of the truth given the age of the boys involved. He spent his final years in the industry as a pariah, a ghost haunting the fringes of a world he once ruled. Jonathan King's story is a chilling example of how the eccentricity of the British elite was often used as a smokescreen for abuse. He was a man who believed his talent gave him a free pass to exploit the vulnerable, and his inability to accept his guilt, even to this day, remains the ultimate proof of his moral corruption. He was not a character. He was a criminal who hid behind a mask of pop frivolity. Dave Lee Travis. For millions of radio listeners in the 1970s and 80s, Dave Lee Travis was the voice of the morning. Known affectionately as the Hairy Cornflake due to his bushy beard and his breakfast show slot, he was a titan of the airwaves. He was a man who commanded an audience of millions on BBC Radio 1, a presenter of Top of the Pops, and a household name who projected an image of boundless warmth and bonhomie. With his booming voice and his teddy bear persona, he was the antithesis of the aloof celebrity. He was the man of the people, the friendly giant who would happily pose for a photograph or sign an autograph. However, this tactile, overfamiliar public image was, in reality, a convenient camouflage for a man who felt his celebrity status gave him the right to cross every boundary of decency. Travis was a man who thrived on physical contact, but for many young women in the industry, his friendliness was suffocating and predatory. He became infamous for what was known as the Travis hug, a maneuver where he would envelop women in his arms, pressing his body against theirs in a way that was not affectionate, but deeply intrusive. For decades, he operated in the corridors of the BBC and at public appearances with a sense of entitlement that was breathtaking. He believed that because he was the hairy cornflake, the star of the show, any attention he bestowed upon a woman should be received as a gift. He treated female colleagues and fans not as professionals or people, but as props for his own amusement, often making lewd comments or grabbing them under the guise of horseplay. The madness of Dave Lee Travis lay in his absolute refusal to accept that the world had changed or that his behavior had ever been wrong. When he was arrested in 2012 as part of Operation U-Tree, the investigation into historic abuse, his reaction was not one of humility, but of incandescent rage. He viewed himself not as a suspect, but as a victim of a witch hunt. In a display of staggering narcissism, he invited the world's press to his home, where he launched into a bizarre and rambling tirade. He compared his suffering to that of political prisoners and famously declared that his human rights were being infringed, all while the women he had assaulted were forced to relive their trauma in silence. It was the behavior of a man whose ego had become so inflated that he could no longer see the ground beneath his feet. During his high-profile trial, the court heard from women who described him as a groper and an opportunist who would strike when he thought no one was looking, in studio booths, in pantomime dressing rooms, and at promotional events. Yet, Travis sat in the dock shaking his head, portraying himself as a misunderstood entertainer from a bygone era. He seemed genuinely baffled that his tactile nature was being criminalized, a disconnect that revealed just how deeply ingrained his sense of privilege was. He was eventually convicted of indecent assault, a verdict that shattered his reputation. The hairy cornflake was revealed to be a creepy old man who had used his position of power to intimidate and violate women for years. The fall of Dave Lee Travis was a slow, painful puncturing of a national myth. He was stripped of his radio shows and his standing in the industry, left to live out his days in bitterness. His story is a potent reminder of how the culture of the 1970s and 80s often masked predatory behavior as good old-fashioned fun. Travis was a man who believed his own hype, thinking that his popularity was a shield that would protect him forever. In the end, his legacy is not the records he played or the jokes he told, but the fear he instilled in the women who had the misfortune of being caught in his friendly embrace. He was a national treasure who rusted in the spotlight, exposing the corrosive nature of unchecked celebrity. Frank Bough. In the 1980s, there was no figure in British broadcasting who commanded more respect or radiated more wholesome reliability than Frank Bough. He was the undisputed king of the breakfast sofa, the anchor of Grandstand, and the face of the BBC's flagship morning program, Breakfast Time. With his velvet voice, his calm demeanor, and his collection of pastel sweaters, he was affectionately known as Mr. Clean. He was the nation's favorite uncle, the steady hand who guided millions of families through the news and sport while they buttered their toast. To the public, he was the epitome of safe, middle-class respectability, a man whose life seemed as neatly pressed as his trousers. He was a national treasure in the truest sense, trusted implicitly by viewers who believed his off-screen life mirrored the gentle persona he presented on air. However, behind the perfectly coiffed hair and the polite professional smile lay a secret life of staggering depravity that would eventually shatter his reputation into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Frank Bough was not merely living a double life, he was inhabiting a shadow world that seemed to belong to a rock star on a self-destructive bender rather than a 60-year-old television presenter. While he was preaching family values and interviewing politicians on screen, he was spending his nights in the seedy underworld of London, frequenting dungeons and attending parties where Class A substances were served as freely as afternoon tea. He developed a dependency on illicit powders that fueled a voracious and dangerous appetite for vice. The madness of Frank Bough was his reckless, almost pathological belief that he could maintain this dangerous duality forever without consequence. He would leave the television studios, still high on the adrenaline of live broadcasting, and head straight to the apartments of escorts and dealers who knew exactly who he was. He would allegedly dress in lingerie and participate in humiliating rituals, seeking a dark thrill that his safe, comfortable, and wealthy life could not provide. It was a compulsion that defied all logic, a man with a loving wife, a lucrative career, and the adoration of the public risking it all for a fleeting high in a sordid basement. He was a man who seemed to get a kick out of the sheer proximity to danger, dancing on the edge of a volcano while wearing a cardigan. The House of Cards collapsed spectacularly in 1988 when the News of the World published a devastating exposé that remains one of the biggest scandals in British tabloid history. The headline, "Frank Bough, Cocaine and Vice Girl Shame," sent shockwaves through the country that are hard to overstate. It was akin to discovering that the vicar was running a cartel. The details were sordid and graphic, painting a picture of a man who had completely lost his moral compass. Bough was sacked by the BBC instantly, his career incinerated overnight. The man who had been the epitome of respectability was now the punchline of every joke in the country, a symbol of hypocrisy. He attempted to apologize to the nation, claiming he had been stupid and naive, but the image of Mr. Clean snorting lines in a dungeon was too powerful to be erased. Even after the initial scandal destroyed his livelihood, Bough seemed unable to escape the grip of his demons. In 1992, he was caught again at a vice party in a dungeon where illicit substances were present, proving that his descent into debauchery was a deep-seated addiction rather than a one-off mistake. He spent his final decades in the wilderness of the industry, a ghost of his former self. He lived out his days in relative obscurity, a national treasure who had tarnished himself beyond redemption. He died in 2020, leaving behind a legacy that is a cautionary tale of how the pressure of perfection can lead to a catastrophic implosion. Frank Bough was the ultimate example of a public figure whose private madness for the forbidden consumed the very life he had worked so hard to build. Freddie Starr. In the anarchic landscape of British comedy during the 1970s and 80s, Freddie Starr was the undisputed king of chaos. He was a performer of almost frightening energy, a man who could switch from a pitch-perfect Elvis Presley impression to a manic, physical routine that bordered on the psychotic in the blink of an eye. He was the highest-paid entertainer on television, a star who commanded audiences of 15 million on The Freddie Starr Show and An Audience with Freddie Starr. To the public, he was the lovable rogue, the unpredictable genius who famously, though falsely, ate a hamster in a tabloid headline. He was a national treasure, whose erratic behavior was celebrated as the mark of a true eccentric. However, behind the laughter and the slapstick, there was a darkness to his unpredictability that was known only to those unfortunate enough to be trapped in a dressing room with him. Freddie Starr's madness was not just a stage persona, it was a lifestyle of excess and control. He was a man who demanded total obedience from those around him, often using his physical dominance and his celebrity status to intimidate women. For decades, stories circulated in the industry about his backstage behavior, whispers of a man who could not distinguish between a willing participant and a terrified fan. He operated with a sense of entitlement that was staggering, believing that his fame gave him the right to take whatever and whoever he wanted. In the 1970s, at the height of his fame, he was treated like a rock god, surrounded by an entourage that insulated him from the consequences of his actions. He was a man who lived on the edge of acceptable behavior, pushing boundaries until they broke, often leaving a trail of distress in his wake. The unraveling of the Freddie Starr myth began in earnest with the Operation U-Tree investigation in 2012. When allegations of historic sexual abuse surfaced, accusing him of groping and assaulting young women during his heyday, Starr did not retreat into humility. Instead, he displayed a defiant arrogance that would ultimately be his undoing. He vehemently denied the claims, portraying himself as a victim of a witch hunt and a celebrity culture that had turned on its heroes. In a moment of supreme hubris, he decided to sue one of his accusers, a woman named Karen Ward, for libel after she claimed he had groped her in a dressing room in 1974. He believed that his charm and his legacy would sway the court, that a judge would never believe a fan over a star. The High Court trial in 2015 was a disaster for Starr. In a devastating judgment, the judge ruled that on the balance of probabilities, the allegations were true. He described Starr as a man who had shown a complete lack of moral compass and dismissed his libel claim. The national treasure was effectively branded a groper in the eyes of the law, and he was ordered to pay a legal bill estimated at £1 million. The verdict destroyed him. He was not just financially ruined, his reputation was incinerated. The man who had once owned racehorses and mansions was forced to sell his assets and flee the country, unable to face the shame and the debts he had accrued in his arrogant attempt to silence his victim. Freddie Starr spent his final years in a sad, self-imposed exile on the Costa del Sol in Spain. He lived as a recluse in a small townhouse, a world away from the bright lights of the London Palladium. He was a bitter, isolated figure, ranting against the injustices he believed he had suffered, completely unable to accept responsibility for the actions that had led him there. In May 2019, he was found dead in his armchair, alone in front of the television. He had been dead for days before anyone found him. It was a sordid, lonely end for a man who had once been the life and soul of the nation. Freddie Starr was a genius of comedy, but he was also a man whose madness for control and gratification consumed him, leaving him to die in poverty and disgrace, thousands of miles from the applause he craved. Sir Clement Freud. For nearly half a century, Sir Clement Freud was the embodiment of dry, intellectual British wit. As the grandson of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, he carried a surname that was synonymous with the human mind, yet he carved out his own unique niche as a broadcaster, a politician, and a celebrity chef. With his hangdog expression, his mournful voice, and his razor-sharp repartee, he was a beloved fixture on the BBC Radio 4 panel show Just a Minute for over 40 years. He was the Liberal Member of Parliament for the Isle of Ely, a man who mingled with prime ministers and was knighted by the Queen in 1987 for his services to the nation. He was famously the face of a dog food brand in a series of iconic television commercials, appearing alongside a bloodhound that shared his droopy features. To the public, he was a lovable curmudgeon, a man of immense intelligence and charm who was a national treasure in every sense of the word. However, behind the facade of the respectable elder statesman and the amusing radio personality lay a predator of chilling calculation. Clement Freud was not merely a man with a dark secret, he was a serial abuser who used his intellect, his fame, and his illustrious lineage to intimidate and silence his victims. He operated with a sense of entitlement that was almost aristocratic, viewing young women and girls not as people, but as objects to be collected and used for his own perverse gratification. His modus operandi was terrifyingly effective. He would often target vulnerable families or aspiring young individuals, using his position as a member of parliament or a famous broadcaster to gain their trust. He would invite them to his homes in London or Suffolk, dazzling them with his culinary skills and his stories of the elite, before crossing boundaries in a way that left his victims confused and terrified. The madness of Clement Freud lay in his absolute confidence that he was untouchable. He believed that his intellect and his status placed him above the moral laws that governed ordinary people. He was a man who could charm a room full of voters in the afternoon and then subject a child to horrific abuse in the evening, compartmentalizing his life with a psychopathic efficiency. He relied on the fact that he was Sir Clement, a man of the establishment. Who would believe a young girl over a knight of the realm? Who would dare to challenge the grandson of Sigmund Freud? He used this power imbalance as a weapon, threatening his victims with legal action or social ruin if they ever dared to speak out. He was a master manipulator who knew exactly how to play the game of reputation management. It was only after his death in 2009, when he was hailed in obituaries as a man of many talents and a great wit, that the silence was finally broken. In 2016, an ITV documentary titled Exposure blew the lid off his decades of abuse. 3 women came forward to detail the harrowing experiences they had suffered at his hands, some dating back to the 1940s and 50s. The revelations were shocking. The man who had been a trusted voice on the radio for generations was revealed to be a pedophile and a predator. The police later confirmed that they had received allegations against him during his lifetime, but somehow, the national treasure had always managed to slip through the net, protected by the deferential culture of the time. The legacy of Clement Freud was instantly and irrevocably destroyed. His family, including his widow and his children, were left to deal with the fallout of his monstrous double life. The blue plaque that had been erected in his honor was removed, and his name became a byword for the establishment cover-ups of the 20th century. He was a man who had spent his life analyzing the quirks of others with his dry humor, yet he had hidden a darkness within himself that was far more twisted than anything his grandfather could have theorized. Sir Clement Freud died a celebrated man, attending garden parties and literary festivals until the end, but he is now remembered only as a predator who used his knighthood as a shield to hide his crimes. His story is a stark reminder that intelligence and wit are no guarantee of morality, and that sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who make us laugh. Max Clifford. For nearly 50 years, Max Clifford was the ultimate gatekeeper of British celebrity culture. He was not a performer who sang or danced, yet he was arguably more powerful than any star he represented. As the king of spin, he was the man who decided what the public saw on the front pages of the tabloids every Sunday morning. With his perfectly tailored suits, his soft, reassuring voice, and his contacts book that reached into the highest offices of government and media, Clifford was the architect of modern fame. He could bury a scandal that would destroy a career, or he could manufacture a sensation out of thin air. To the aspiring starlets of the 1970s and 80s, he was the golden ticket. A meeting with Max was the closest thing to a guarantee of stardom. He was a trusted figure on television, often appearing as the voice of reason in documentaries, shaping the narrative of the nation with a terrifying precision. However, behind the facade of the benevolent dealmaker lay a predator of supreme arrogance and manipulation. Clifford did not just manage talent, he exploited the desperate and the young with a cold, calculated efficiency. His offices on New Bond Street in Mayfair were not just a place of business, they were a trap. For decades, he used the promise of film roles and modeling contracts to lure women into his private world. He operated on a lie that was as old as Hollywood itself, the casting couch. He would tell young, impressionable women that physical intimacy was the price of admission to the industry, that being nice to him was how business was done. He relied on his immense power to silence them. Who would believe an unknown girl from the suburbs over the man who had the editors of the national press on speed dial? He was a master of intimidation, often reminding his victims that he could destroy their reputations with a single phone call if they ever dared to speak out. The madness of Max Clifford lay in his absolute belief that he was the puppet master who could never be caught. He had spent his life covering up the sins of others, burying the secrets of politicians and pop stars, and he believed this gave him an impenetrable shield of insurance. He thought he knew too much about too many powerful people to ever be touched. He acted with impunity, treating women like disposable assets to be used for his own gratification. During the 1970s and 80s, he would allegedly conduct auditions that had nothing to do with acting and everything to do with his own depraved appetites. He was a man who thrived on control, enjoying the power he held over the dreams of others. He was the spider in the center of a vast, sticky web, confident that no fly could ever break free. His downfall, when it finally came, was a moment of poetic justice. Following the exposure of Jimmy Savile in 2012, the police launched Operation U-Tree and the wall of silence began to crumble. When Clifford was arrested, his reaction was not fear, but disdain. He laughed at the accusations on live television, branding his accusers as fantasists and gold diggers looking for a payout. He truly believed that his ability to spin a story would save him in court. He treated the legal process with the same arrogance he had treated his victims, confident that his charm would sway the jury. But the era of the king of spin was over. In 2014, he became the first high-profile figure to be convicted under the U-Tree investigation, found guilty of 8 counts of indecent assault against teenage girls and young women. The judge described his crimes as groomed and contemptuous, sentencing him to 8 years in prison. The man who had lived in luxury, driving Bentleys and dining in the finest restaurants, was reduced to a prisoner number. His fall was total. His wife divorced him, his business collapsed, and his reputation was incinerated. Max Clifford died in prison in 2017, a lonely and broken man. He had spent a lifetime manipulating the truth, but in the end, the truth buried him. His story is the final, damning chapter of an era where powerful men believed they could rewrite reality to suit their own desires. He was the man who knew where all the bodies were buried, only to find that he had dug his own grave with decades of deceit and abuse.